You remove the Americans from the equation, you let the chips fall where they may, you'll get serious conflicts in places that the Americans used to hold together. These are the places where I expect them to be most explosive. Now, for those of you who know your world history, you'll recognize that these are the places that have seen the greatest wars in the history of our species. And for those of you who know economic history, you'll recognize these zones as the areas that have seen the greatest economic growth since 1945. There's no coincidence. That's because of the order. The Americans forced everyone to be on the same side and outlawed war among the various order members so that we were all on the same side against the Soviets. But with the Americans gone, history reasserts. And these zones are responsible for 3/4 of global energy shipments, agricultural shipments, and manufacturing supply chain steps. This is the end of the world that we know. Now, the gentleman who's kind of midwifing this process is this guy. This is Robert Lighthizer. He's the U.S. Trade Representative. He's responsible for enforcing and negotiating every trade deal we have. Now, this is not his first stint in government. He also worked for Team Reagan back during the 1980s. Now, if you dial back to the 1980s, the Cold War was running hot and heavy. We actually had a nuclear scare over Berlin in 1983. And a lot of the Allies were doing things that the Reagan administration was not overly fond of. Specifically, the Germans, the French, the Japanese, they were all intervening egregiously in currency markets to push down the value of their currencies versus the US dollar so they could export more to the American market. Kind of violated the spirit of the order, but Reagan really needed everyone lined up shoulder to shoulder with us against the Soviets, so he's willing to look the other way. When he accepts a job, he makes sure he has all of the cards. He makes sure he has political cover, and then he doesn't negotiate. He forces his solution on whoever's on the other side of the table. This is the guy who's been in charge of every trade talk the United States has engaged in for the last 3.5 years. And he's generated results. These are the 5 deals that matter to the United States: Korea, Japan, Canada, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. And these are countries that honestly don't have a lot of choice. South Korea doesn't exist without American security overwatch. They had to capitulate on every point of the program. Canada has no other options, and it can't pivot to another trading partner. The United Kingdom destroyed its links to the European Union, so it's a deal on Washington's terms or an economic depression. We'll see that deal happen later this year. And it has been seared into the collective memory of Japan just what happens when the United States turns hostile. Of these 5, only Mexico has any wiggle room because Mexico has things that the United States wants: a young demographic, a growing market, and a complementary economic system. So with the exception of the deal with the United Kingdom, which will happen later this year, deals with these countries aren't simply sewn up. They've already been implemented. It's done. And that just leaves China. Now, I could give you 30, 40 reasons why China will not be in existence as a unified nation state a decade from now. But really, this is the single most important. It's the islands that roughly parallel the Chinese coast: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. It's not just that they're all allies, although they are. It's that they form something that the Chinese call the first island chain. And the Chinese have never, in any period of their 3,500-year-long history, ever been able to penetrate that chain in a commercial manner and integrate economically with the world beyond. There is one exception. Today, under the order, because the Americans have forced everyone to be on the same side. But if you remove the Americans from the equation, this region goes back being more antagonistic. And China simply lacks, China has lacked its entire history, the military capacity to enforce any sort of globe-spanning trade system. In fact, any sort of East Asian-centric trade system. All the Americans have to do, if the goal really is to destroy China, is go home. Now, I said there are 30 to 40 reasons. I'm going to give you a couple more. Let's look at demographics. Now, this is the Chinese demographic in 1980. You'll notice it's very young. And when China joined the order after Nixon went to China, they were able to produce goods at a price that no one could compete with because they had so many young people, supply and demand. But if you fast forward 20 years, it looks a little bit different. Between 1980 and 2015, China experienced the perfect demographic moment. And there were three pieces to it. First, they had lots of young people, so low production costs. Well, that was over 20 years ago. And Chinese labor costs since 2000 have increased by more than a factor of 10. Second, Chinese young adults had few kids with higher spending in the short run. That's the Chinese boom that we've seen these last 10 years, but that's nearly over. There's a consumption trough coming. And third, China cannibalized the countryside to fuel urban activity, and that's over. The countryside is now nearly empty of people of reproductive age. In many ways, the Chinese development story is a bit like what happened here in the United States with the move from the farm to the city. But whereas in the United States it happened over 2 centuries, in China it happened in just one generation. So here's the Chinese demography today. They are enjoying one last burst of consumption before that one block of population ages into not being significant consumers in the future. They've not only aged out of their beautiful demographic moment, the Chinese have aged past the point of demographic recovery. And it shows up in their labor data. These are several Southeast Asian countries that I think will actually do pretty well in the world we're moving into. This is Mexico, a country with very competitive. And here's the labor cost in the People's Republic of China. They have simply moved past the point where they can participate in a meaningful trade system. In fact, if you look at the consumption numbers, it's really bad. Here is domestic car sales month by month from a year earlier. Now, that big drop off in January of 2000, that's from the coronavirus pandemic. That is what you would expect when people don't go outside, they don't buy cars. That's not what I talk about, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the trouble that China is in. I'm looking at the 2 years previous. Look at how negative that is. Now, this is pre-COVID. This is in 2019. This is in 2018. This is when the big story was how China was going to take over everyone and rule the world and be a big consumption-led economy. It's just that it's not true. Even within their own system, even with their own data, China has already gone terminal. They also have a shorter-term problem. Trade talks. Look who's there. Lighthizer has been in charge of all the trade talks everywhere in the world, wherever they happen to be. Now, this is the guy who wrote the World Trade Organization Charter. This is arguably the most free trade person in the American political establishment today. And if you look at what might happen after November, whether it's Trump or Biden, the Chinese cannot count on anything getting easier, because either Trump will win, in which case Lighthizer only has one country to focus on, or Biden will win. And Biden has personally called President Xi Jinping a thug and has advocated a series of anti-Chinese trade policies that are far more strict than what we're facing today. 2019 was as good as it was going to get. To put this more short term, this gentleman, Ambassador Branstad from Iowa, used to be the governor. He is arguably the person in the United States most capable of generating a positive working relationship with the Chinese because he's on a first name basis with President Xi Jinping of China. Branstad and Xi have been friends since they first met in 1985. And so when Trump appointed Branstad to be ambassador, everybody assumed that things were going to go swimmingly. Well, after months of relations deteriorating, Branstad last week wrote an op-ed about how the relationship was falling apart and what the Chinese had done to push it in that direction. The Chinese, of course, immediately censored the document, and Branstad resigned this Monday morning. Whoever replaces him is going to be a China hawk, not a China dove.